Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today, where we're going to be looking at why tenancy disputes are still happening and hopefully giving everyone who attends actionable insights and tips on how to stop them occurring at all. As always, today is for general information purposes only. It is not and must not be construed as legal advice or official guidance. So with that caveat in mind, I would love for our guests today to introduce themselves. Thank you both so much for taking out your time to prepare for and to be on today's webinar and to share your insights. In surname alphabetical order, I'm going to hand over to a man who looks a little like the man on the screen, Kristjan Byfield.
Raj, thanks for having me, buddy. So yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm Kristjan. I have a single branch estate and lettings agency in London, and I'm also one of the founders of the Depositary, which is a tenancy conclusion software solution that we've built in partnership with TDS.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Kristjan. And Alison, could you possibly introduce yourself to the audience?
I'd be delighted to do so. Morning, everyone. I'm Alison MacDougall. I have nothing like as exciting a title as Kristjan. I work for TDS. I'm the Director of Resolution, which means that I cover all things tenancy deposit dispute related across the UK. We also have a fledgling conciliation and mediation service, which is to do with tenant and landlord problems during the course of the tenancy. You will also have noticed, I think, that I don't entirely look like my photograph on the screen. Neither does Kristjan, to be fair. But mine is due to the fact that overnight I have lost a crown. So apologies that I look a bit like a pirate, and I hope it's not too distracting to what I'm going to say. Delighted to be here, thank you.
And you definitely look more professional than Kristjan in every situation. And so with
to be fair, who doesn't?
Oh, that's true. And so I want to start with a relatively blunt question. In your opinion, why are tenancy deposit disputes still happening? Alison, would you like to kick us off on that?
Yes, sure. I mean, the first thing is just to set a bit of context. In our experience, the number of disputes is going down. So even before the events of the past 12 or 15 months, we were seeing the first signs in 14 years of the number of disputes sent to us starting to, first of all, moderate and then actually fall. So that's good news. And I think the second scene setter is that our statistics show that only around 1% of the tenancies where we protect the deposit end up in dispute. So in the overwhelming majority of cases, although there may be some disagreements, the parties are able to work it out amongst themselves. They might be using the sort of software that Kristjan will talk about. But they don't need formal intervention or people to help them out. So, you know, the numbers are big. We deal with over 20,000 of them a year, but they are coming down a bit. Why do they still happen? I think it's they are that heady mix. They involve people, they involve money, and they involve a valuable asset, which is the landlord's property and the place that's been the tenant's home. I also think people tend to be in a bit of a hurry at the end of a tenancy. So the landlord might want some money back from the deposit so that they can get the property ready for the next tenancy. And the tenant, on the other hand, wants as much of their deposit back as possible, probably to put it down as a deposit on the next property. So, you know, I think it's just a bit of that heady mix of people and money and property. It's mainly tenants who come to us with deposit disputes. So about 75% of our cases are raised by tenants. They're mainly still about cleaning and damage, and always have been. But I think, you know, if I just skip forward to what the outcomes tend to be, mostly in the majority of cases, the awards that we make are split between the parties. So that tends to suggest that, in a sense, both parties have a point. You know, the landlord's got a point about making a claim. The tenant probably has a point which helps to mitigate the claim that's being made or the amount that's being awarded. So in most cases, we can sort of see why there's a dispute there, because both parties have some validity in their arguments. There are, of course, the handful of disputes that we get each year for very small amounts of money, sometimes less than £10, and they tend to be actually nothing to do with the quantum, nothing actually even to do with the item itself, just to do with the principle. And they are the ones where the relationship between the parties has really broken down badly, and they're just determined to fight it out, despite the fact it's over, 3 teaspoons or, a teacup. So that's a bit of a roundabout explanation as to why I think they still arise.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Alison. And so at the heart of it, you've got people, obviously. And what I took from that is it can often be a point of principle rather than the underlying whatever they're disputing may be less significant than the underlying breakdown in the relationship. So and then Kristjan, you're almost unique. I say almost because I can't think of anybody else, but there may be others who you've built a successful and very well-known agency. You've started a prop tech business. Could you just talk us through your journey, why you did that, and why do you think deposit disputes are still happening?
Yeah, so I mean, the depository originally came around because we constantly look at our business and how it works, and we try and look at it from 2 perspectives. We look at it from our operational staff facilitation, job satisfaction sort of point, but also a consumer experience. And we try and find solutions for both of those. And about 5 years ago, we do this as a company. We try and do it every year. And about 5 years ago, the one thing that we all unanimously agreed upon as a business was at the end of tenancy process is it's just pretty horrendous for agents, really. You're never in a let. I don't think you're ever in a more of a no-win situation than at the end of a tenancy, when you're trying to find that balance between what your client's expectations are and what a tenant's expectations are, and trying to help bring them to that sort of middle of the road agreement. A tenant will regularly accuse you of trying to help facilitate a landlord steal money from them. And equally, if you're too protective of the tenants, then a landlord can easily accuse you of being too tenant biased and not protecting their best interests as the client. So it's a really tricky little spot. It's heavily regulated. There's lots of timeframes in there. I think for tenants, there were a few challenges we came into this wanting to solve. So first of all, tenants generally just don't understand what is involved. So for most tenants, they move out of a property and pretty much from a day or 2 after that, they want to know why they haven't got their money back already. And so part of the challenge is trying to enlighten tenants on exactly what is involved in that process, because there are a lot of steps. If you're doing it properly from checkout, the agent's got to obtain that checkout report, liaise with the client whether or not there are to be any deductions, and then present those to the tenant. Then you've got that negotiation process and so on from there. But at the same time, what we also know is, because we've tried this in the past, if you try and educate tenants by just providing them with reams and reams of information, huge documents, tons of emails all about different aspects of their responsibilities, they don't engage with it, and quite frankly, why should they? What tenant wants to educate themselves about the end of a tenancy when they've just moved into a tenancy? And equally, even at the end of a tenancy, if you're like, here's a 5-page document on how tenancies conclude and the do's and don'ts, you'll be lucky if they get 2 paragraphs in. So what we wanted to do was make the process transparent. And so one of the things we've done within our platform is basically there's a timeline of that process. So it's a very visual representation of the steps it takes to go from once notice has been served all the way through to a refund, or as we've talked about now, a dispute. So that was a massive part of it. And then, on the agent side of things, the process is hugely repetitive. I think most agents will know that, there will be a set of emails that they send out in that journey. There's obviously the transactional steps to leap through. But a lot of energy is spent on that journey with agents, tenants chasing, where are we at? Where's my money? When am I getting it back? All this sort of thing. So, and it's highly repetitive. And what we're seeing now with the transactions that we have go through our platform is actually we see quite an even split into 3/3. So we see about a third of tenancies transition through our platform with virtually no friction in there at all. The tenant moves out, the agent or landlord either proposes no deductions or proposes deductions that the tenant considers very reasonable. They're readily accepted and it goes through to reconcile. But on those tenancies in our platform, an agent will spend about 10 minutes facilitating that process. For most agents, facilitating even an easy tenancy like that is probably a good couple of hours work. Then we've got the sort of middle third where things tend to be a bit more negotiated at the deduction stage. There's a little bit more back and forth. There's a bit more, required from the agent and the landlord to interact. And then we've got the final third where there's quite a lot of tension throughout that whole process and everything is quite heated, and it's a lot more involved. So really what we were trying to do for our agents is for that first third that pretty much sort of can just sort of track itself through a process. We really want to take that third completely off an agent's desk. We want to make the middle third easier. And all of that is to free an agent up to give the attention and hands-on service that they need to for that final third to try and get everyone on side and by doing so reduce disputes happening. But I mean, going back to your first question to Alison, and basic, and this supports very much what we've said now. I mean, I think there's two key reasons for disputes: a lack of understanding, be that a tenant on their responsibilities or contractual terms, or a landlord on what is not only legitimate to request from a principal charge, but also dilapidations. If it's redecoration, when was the flat redecorated? If it's a damaged sofa, when did they buy the sofa? These are all contingent things. And as Alison's alluded to, emotion as well. All emotion comes into this far too often. A tenant is angry about being asked for a broken mirror because their central heating didn't work for a week. The landlord is furious about the fact there's 3 broken wine glasses out of the principle of the matter. Out of principle is probably, if you banned that rationale within deposit deductions, I guess you would probably eliminate about a third of deposit disputes, just as a guess. But yeah, that's what we set out to do with the depository in our journey, and that's really the two key drivers that I think are the precursor to why disputes end up happening.
Brilliant, thank you. And as a reminder to the audience, please do submit your questions, comments, insights. We've got about 200 people live, 500 people have registered for today's webinar. So I'm sure that you come across this in your daily jobs or within your organization. So please do let us know what you think and pose questions. Kristjan, you made up a fact on the spot. I'm hoping I'm not doing that right now. So I'm going to go to the TDS statistical briefing, which said that 74% of disputes were from cleaning and damage. Fact check me if you wish, Alison. But if that's the case, then why are they such problematic areas, do you think, Kristjan? Start with you, Kristjan.
I mean, interestingly, we've been looking at stats in our platform, and actually the most common thing that we see being discussed, not necessarily disputed, but proposed, is actually sort of decorative damages, scuffs to walls, marks from pictures and things like that. That's a really common one. Cleaning, I think, as we talked about before, you want to remove the emotion. The trouble with certain things is there isn't a technical standard there, and there isn't, even if there was, how do you impose that? And what I mean by that is one person's dirty is another person's clean, and vice versa. And we experienced this as an agency when we first started Base. We set out and we actually said, you know what, we're not going to force our tenants to have a professional clean at the end of the tenancy because, well, they're perfectly. I mean, obviously now with the framework, you can't mandate that, but before the tenant fee ban, you could contractually mandate that. We used to. When we started, we didn't. And the problem that quickly evolved out of that was we would have tenants say, they would clean it themselves, they would hand it back, we'd do our inspection, and several elements wouldn't be clean enough. And where the emotion would come in would be, not only were you saying, oh, I'm going to have to deduct this money, but what you were also saying was, you've left a dirty property, which triggers an emotion in the people. And also you're saying, you haven't done a very good job. So, there's several emotional triggers in there. And we thought we were trying to help people, make it easier. And actually what we found by doing that was actually it became more complex and more emotional. So, we now, obviously, like most agents, we recommend and we push wherever we can for a professional cleaner to be involved. And one of the reasons we give to that, if an agent, I'd say most of our tenants actually quite readily agree with it, because at the end of the day, particularly in London, the cost of a clean versus, their rent and living costs is fairly minor. So they're sort of more willing and ready to pay that lump of money. And again, if you've got joint tenants as well, it avoids that other dynamic of who's cleaned what to what standard and who's liable for what. So, but we actually find bringing a professional cleaner in there, even if that cleaner doesn't do a clean to the ideal standard, and we have a new tenant move in and they go, oh, well, I'm not very happy. The inside of the kitchen cabinets are a bit sticky and there's a bit of grease on the underside of the cooker hood. That's fine, because we just send our professional cleaners back in to address those issues and everyone's happy. There's no cost to anyone. We're not criticizing or commenting on a job an individual has done. It's just a professional relationship. So we've, that I think with the cleaning one, I think it's that thing of how there is no precise standard of exactly what is clean enough.
Okay.
And I think that's the problem.
That's a good point at which to hand over to Alison. So I quoted the stat from your statistical briefing. Why do you think there are so many disputes around this area? And I guess what could be done to mitigate or avoid them?
Cleaning in our experience is still the single most common area, but I would agree with Kristjan to an extent that it has become less prominent over the years, if I can put it that way. I'll come back to cleaning in a minute. I think as far as damage is concerned, damage just covers an awful lot of stuff. And I think we all understand from our own experience of just living in our own properties that things change in a property by the mere fact that people live in it. So usually when we see damage claims, it's actually not so much that the tenant disagrees that things have changed. If you've got a semi-decent inventory and checkout report, there's usually an acceptance that the item didn't look the same at the end of the tenancy as it did at the beginning. And so actually the arguments are slightly more sophisticated. They're about, well, that's just what happens anyway, so it's about fair wear and tear. Or it's possibly about the sort of remedy that the agent or landlord is looking for. So the tenant will say, well, yes, it is a chip, but honestly, you don't need to replace the entire worktop. So it's an argument about quantum, not about the fact that something is damaged or has changed. And sometimes it's, as we've discussed, it's just about the principle. I do agree, though, that cleaning is just a more emotive thing as far as tenants are concerned. It's still very common in the submissions that we see to just get this sense that tenants just feel really insulted that the suggestion is being made that they, haven't kept the property clean, and they seem to equate that to, a personal insult. So there's just something that is more emotive, I think, about cleaning. I honestly, I've been doing this for 14 years and I haven't come across a satisfactory answer to it. Kristjan's alluded to this already. It used to be the case, obviously, contractually, people would put in the requirement for a professional clean. The Tenant Fees Act has put an end to that. And tenants, are aware of that, and they do quite often come forward now in their submissions and say, but wait a minute, they're not entitled to professional clean. And of course, in a strict enforcing a specific clause in the tenancy agreement, that's correct. However, the approach that we take is that the tenant is required to clean the property to the same standard that it was at the start of the tenancy. So if you've got a good inventory and maybe a receipt as well to show that the property was professionally cleaned, actually better, something that says it was cleaned to professional standard at the start of the tenancy, then that is the expectation of the standard that the tenant should return it to at the end. It's got nothing to do with the Tenant Fees Act. It's just give the property back as you found it. So, professional clean is still very much part of the landscape. It's just a slightly different argument now. And, my recommendation would just be always to make it as clear as you possibly can how clean the property was at the start of the tenancy, to give the tenant a fair chance to comment on that, to see whether they agree or not. And at the end of the tenancy, that is the standard. I totally take Kristjan's point that people will disagree about what the definitions mean, but at least you've got a starting point for the discussion.
Really useful. I'm just going to follow up on that then, which is you talked about the expected standard and allowance for fair wear and tear. Are you seeing anything around heightened levels of wear and tear as people are at home and have been more so over the past year? Is that crossing your desk at all in the disputes?
I don't think we've come across it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. Obviously people have been using properties to far greater extent than, first of all, they want to, and secondly, they had expected to. So I wouldn't be surprised if that became an argument, but we haven't seen it. But I think there's an element to which it will be a continuing argument if the balance between working in an office and working at home has really changed permanently. Then this may be a more permanent feature.
Brilliant, thank you. Going to go on to, so we talked about why disputes happen and Kristjan's journey to starting the depository. Going to come on to stopping disputes, I guess is the crux of it. So what are the best practices around that? So how can agents minimize deposit disputes at the beginning of tenancies? Alison, would you like to kick us off on that? So what could and should agents be doing?
Sure. I think Kristjan's probably touched a little bit on this in terms of, the difficulty, I suppose, of engaging tenants at the start of the tenancy in particular, as to, what it is to be a tenant. And of course, there are a huge range of tenants. There are very experienced tenants. And there are people for whom this is their first tenancy. And probably it's quite useful to understand where the individual is on their journey as a tenant, because a more experienced tenant may behave well or badly, but they have some experience of what it's like to occupy a house as their home, but something that they have temporary responsibility for rather than permanent responsibility. But I think it's all about setting the tone of the relationship to the extent that you can. It's about doing the basic things and the groundwork diligently. So I'm not going to go into half an hour about inventories, but clearly, unless you're talking about rent arrears, an inventory is the start and end of the record for what the property was like when the tenant moved in. So, it is never a waste of time to spend time and money on a good quality inventory. For adjudicators have a particular perspective on inventories, but actually I think they're probably most useful for the parties themselves. You give the tenant a document that shows what the property is like. You try to get some sort of buy-in that the tenant agrees that that's what it's like, and it's an agreed record. And then I'm guessing in the 99% of cases that we don't see at the end of the tenancy, some of which have obviously gone through Kristjan's platform, you've got that document, and however much your recollection may differ, you can always point to that document at the end of the tenancy and say, well, it's just not the same, is it? And it's a starting point for a discussion about what's changed during the tenancy. So, please, as I'm sure you've all heard a million times, get an inventory provider or way of doing your own inventories that you are happy really addresses some of the historic problems that you might have come up against. Maybe because you've had to bring a dispute to the TDS or one of our competitors, and I just can't overstate how important that is. But some of the other things, I guess, that we see quite commonly, and again, probably goes back a little bit to the experience of individual people as tenants. I'm personally quite conscious that if I rent a place for a holiday for a couple of days even, or a couple of weeks, you go into the property and the first thing you see is this huge folder. A lot of the folder is about the local shops and all the rest of it, but actually a lot of it's about how the cooker works and all the, how to live in the property, and you're only there for 3 days or 2 weeks. But it is quite a big feature of the cases that we see, that there's often an absence of information given to tenants about the basics of living in the property. Again, it's incredibly dull, and a lot of people will say, but they don't read it, but at least it's there. And we do get lots of disputes about contractors being called out to help with the heating system or help with how the cooker works. And it may at the end of the day not have been a fault, but the tenant will say, but I had no idea how to work it. There were no instructions. So, just basic things like that. Just make sure that however skeptical you might be about the tenant's willingness to engage, just make sure the information is there, so that there is always a fallback position. Even if the tenant calls you and says, I can't get this to work, and you say, well, have you looked at the information? Have you tried this and that? It is not rocket science at all, and I'm not underestimating the difficulties of engaging people in this process sometimes, but it is quite it's quite basic groundwork, I think, which would help in a lot of cases.
Amazing, thank you. And I like what we started with, the reasons behind the disputes, and it's people, and it's emotive, and it's emotional, and your big takeaway in the middle piece was if you can ground everything in facts, you're going to be in a better place, because it starts to depersonalize it. So it's not you are dirty or you damaged. It is dirty compared to X, and it is damaged compared to Y. So sort of underlining the need for a good quality inventory. And I know some of the questions coming in are about inventories. Kristjan, over to you. So what can agents do at the start and during a tenancy to avoid disputes?
So look, I think first of all, inventories from a landlord perspective are one of the most misunderstood elements of renting out a property. And I think actually for the value you get for the money a typical inventory costs, I think they are one of the best value for money products, services, solutions, whatever you want to call it, that a landlord can put in place. When you think about a property anywhere in the country, and you think about the value of the internal fittings of that property, your kitchens, your bathrooms, everything, and like I said, your average inventory report is probably somewhere in the region of 150 to 250 quid, depending on the size of your property. When you think of the value of the internal cosmetic condition of your property and the security that document gives a landlord or their agent to make legitimate claims, that is money very well spent, especially when you bear in mind, I think the average UK tenant stays in the property for sort of 2.5 years. I know in our agency, it's closer to 4 years. So that 150 to 200 pounds spread out over 2, 3, 4 years is a tiny investment for as Alison has alluded to, what is a critical document to establish the legitimacy of any claim. Part of the process is also about education. Now, we touched on educating tenants, but it's also important about educating landlords. Like I said, not just only on what is the sort of legally legitimate framework for what can be proposed, but also factoring in dilapidations. You know, you can't ask a tenant to pay for a brand new sofa when they've damaged something that you've had for 18 years. And if we're all honest, we all know had seen better days. You know, yes, they might have spilt wine on it, or they might have not, you know, they weren't allowed to smoke in the property, but they did, and there's a fag burn on the arm. But, you know, the point to allude to that is still 18 years old. So, but for agents, it's a really tricky job. You know, again, agents are sat in that middle road. So one of the things we're trying to do to help agents in that situation is when deductions are made in our platform. Now, whether that's a landlord, because for let-only landlords, an agent's client can propose deductions within our platform themselves, or where an agent has proposed deductions and sent those to the landlord for sign-off. Part of that sign-off process, we have a pre-approved disclaimer with the TDS relevant to that particular category. So let's take, for example, like we said, you know, damage to an item, you know, new for old. If it's damage, in the disclaimer, they have to acknowledge to submit that proposal. In there, it not only sets out the framework of what legitimately can be claimed, but it gives an example of, you know, a sofa is given an approximate lifespan of, let's say, 7 years. And then basically, how old is that item? You know, if you're saying a tenant has completely destroyed that sofa, that might well be the case. But if that sofa is 5 years old, that tenant is not going to be liable for the whole £1,000 that sofa originally cost, because you have to factor in the fact that you've already used that for 5 years before they get to it. So there will be that dilapidation. So we set that out in our platform, but we can't stop a landlord. You know, we can't prevent a landlord. We've got that disclaimer in there. And what we say to agents is there's no way for us to control what a landlord or an agent or a landlord instructs their agent to propose. All we can do is set out the framework so that if a landlord insists on making an unreasonable proposal, if the tenant kicks off, if that ends in a dispute, if the landlord doesn't get the dispute result they thought they were, the agent has that disclaimer to go back to and go, well, hold on a minute. You knew from the very moment you signed off or you proposed that deduction that you were proposing something outside of the permitted framework. Now, I want to give an example of an issue that we had at Base a few years ago. And again, this highlights the challenge of agents in this role. So we had a landlord, tenant had rented their property for a couple of years, was moving out. When the tenant moved in, half the property was carpeted and the carpets were knackered. You know, discoloration around the sides from wearing, there was little bold patches, but you know, the tenant wasn't fussed. They moved in, they had a cat, the landlord knew they had a cat, all fine, got to the end of the tenancy, cat had clawed a couple of bits. Landlord went after the tenant for the full replacement cost of the carpets. I probably spent 3 days having some very contentious, increasingly contentious conversations with our landlords about how unreasonable we thought they were being and how those claims were completely outside of a legitimate framework. And should the tenant dispute that, they categorically wouldn't get a penny of what they were proposing. What happened when we took that charge to the tenant? They accepted the whole thing. And I picked up the phone and called that tenant straight after they accepted it, and to ask, and he said, Kristjan, I was expecting it. The landlord's been like that the whole tenancy. I don't really care. I can afford it, and I'd rather pay that and walk away than spend a month being litigious about it. And of course, we went back to the landlord, and what was the landlord's response? See, told you. If I'd listened to you, I wouldn't have just got £2,000 off my tenant or whatever. I don't think it was that much, but it was a substantial amount. It was over £1,000. And so I just want to give that case as an example of, there aren't too many definites in this landscape. You have to, and particularly as the agent in the middle, you have to play that delicate balance of a game. I want to give one other example, though, of where inventories have categorically saved the day. So we look after one of our larger clients that we look after. We look after a house for him, beautiful townhouse in Spitalfields, for those who know the area. We'd let that for him several years. He came to us one year and he said, guys, going to be taking it off your hands for a year or two. My business partner's son is going to the local art college. He's going to be moving in there with 3 of his art mates. So, don't worry about it. So, absolutely no problem with that. Client's property, they can do what they want. But, we went back, we'd worked with David for several years. We said, okay, well, look, we're happy to help. So we won't charge you a penny, but let us do all the tenancy documents. We'll register the deposit for you and we'll organize a check-in. Oh, no. I'm not going to bother with any of that. It's my business partner's son. David, you absolutely need to do that. Oh, okay, but I'm not going to take a deposit. David, you should absolutely take a deposit. There are 3 people moving into that property you have absolutely no relationship with. So we agreed to actually take, that was pre-tenant fee ban. So that was in the days when we took a 6-week deposit. But, we agreed that he should just do a calendar month because at least it was something. And then he was absolutely adamant he didn't want an inventory, and it got to the point where I said, David, I'll pay for the inventory. I mean, I knew it wasn't about cost, but I was like, you're moving 4 art students into what was a £2 million townhouse. Please, I will pay 250 quid to get a detailed inventory. He came to us after 6 months. This is a guy who has been doing property for 30 years, has done it all, seen it all. He came into our office 6 months later on the edge of tears, having just been to the property. We basically had to take over and kick the 4 of them out. In 6 months, those 4 tenants did over £15,000 worth of damage to the property. They were smoking in bed, putting their cigarettes out on the carpets. There was beautiful parquet wood floors downstairs. They'd been doing spray paint art projects on the floor without putting anything down. They'd cut holes in the wall. This is the son of one of the joint owners and their mates. And what came out of that, and so we were asked to come in and take care of that situation, to bring that tenancy to an end, to get them out and to reconcile those damages. And the immediate response, in particular from the three tenants who weren't part of the partnership, were absolutely not. We're not paying a penny. We turned around and said, well, here's the signed contract. Here is the inventory and check-in report, which all 4 of you have countersigned as accurate. Here are the invoices of all the works that were done before you moved in, including the professional clean to prepare that. And within 2 weeks, they had paid every single penny of those £15,000 worth of damages. It didn't go to dispute because all that documentation was there. And I think what that highlights as well is actually potentially there was a situation with it where even more emotion is involved. I think for us now, whenever we hear a landlord say, oh, I'm going to let a mate move in, or a family member's going to move in, that for us is red flags. The more emotion that comes into it, the more particular you have to be, and when a landlord tells us they're going to rent to a friend or let a mate move in, we're like, great, please let us do your paperwork. Even if you don't want a deposit, let us do a contract, let us organize an inventory, let us do the compliance stuff so it's there. We'll do it free of charge. We'll do all of it because we know 9 times out of 10, this is going to turn nasty at some point.
So I guess this is taking us through the journey, and the reasons behind the disputes seem to be emotional, and the best practice seems to be anything you can possibly do to take the emotion out of the situation, whether that is not having a landlord-tenant situation where there is a pre-existing relationship, whether it is having objective evidence and appropriately drawn up contracts. Anything you can do to make it more factual and less emotional seems to be the sort of underlying thing. Even to Alison's point about having the manuals and the how-to guides for using the property. So again, it is factual. How this is how to do it. Empower the tenant, give them all of the relevant information. You're taking emotion out of the situation. So that takes us to the point at almost the end of the tenancy. So hopefully they've selected someone who they're not related to or work with or know otherwise. Everything's been appropriately documented. How can agents minimize the deposit disputes at the end? So when they're handling the checkout process, what tips have you got there, Alison?
One of the, in a sense, I suppose every case that we see is because something hasn't worked out. But, one of the things that I pick up from a number of agents who perhaps have more success in this area, and again, when I mentioned this to Kristjan a few days ago, he says, well, who has time to do this? But one thing that some agents do think of, which can be quite successful, I think, is to try and visit the property, let's say a month before the tenancy is due to end, and go around. Obviously, it's not an end of tenancy inspection, but it will probably allow you to see, in broad terms, things that might need to be done. And you can warn the tenant that there are a couple of things that you're concerned about and you would really expect to see them sorted by the end of the tenancy. So, maybe there's a bit of mold in the grout in the bathroom or something like that. Just if you can remind the tenants about what's going to happen at the end of the tenancy. There's going to be a checkout. Really great if you could be there. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. What the checkout does, remind the tenant what the property looked like at the start of the tenancy, what the expectations are for the end of the tenancy. Again, it's slightly educational, it's quite time consuming, but it sets the scene for what's about to happen. Now, most of the time, what's about to happen is absolutely fine. You might, as Kristjan says, have a landlord who's absolutely happy to just give the deposit back straight away. You might have a tenant who accepts that some things have gone wrong and they don't have a problem about paying to put that right. And in the middle, there's a huge range of people who can either get themselves to an agreement at the end of the day, or who ultimately have to bring it to an adjudicator's attention, which is absolutely the worst possible outcome because it magnifies all the problems. As I said, I think earlier, the landlord or the agent knows the property, the tenant knows the property, the documentation most of the time is going to help them, because although that documentation might not be perfect, there might be things in the inventory that weren't picked up, there might be things in the checkout that weren't picked up, but actually because the parties know the property, you get through it. Unfortunately, when you come to an adjudicator, the documents are all you have. The adjudicator doesn't know you, doesn't know the parties, doesn't know the property, won't visit the property. The buck stops with the documents, and that is the point at which anything that is deficient about your inventory or your checkout tend to be picked up, because the standard you have to produce these documents for somebody who's independent with no connection to the property at all, tends to have to be higher than it would be just for your discussion between a landlord and an agent and a tenant. So that's why, although it's my job to adjudicate on these things, it's often not enjoyable, because you are dealing with documents that don't really seem to match your need, I guess. And it's partly why a lot of the focus of what we do now is actually trying to avoid things going all the way through to a formal decision by an adjudicator who's imposing a decision on you. Increasingly, we use our experience and our team of people at TDS to contact the parties and try to see whether there is still the possibility of reaching an agreement. And actually, 25-30% of our cases melt away now, because we are able to bring the parties together and sort it out. Just using the fact that we have a vague idea what an adjudicator might decide, and having had the benefit of looking at the evidence, good and bad, and where the evidence might be a little deficient. The other thing, I think, and again, Kristjan has touched on this, is just making sure that your landlords are as educated as your tenants. You just are not entitled to charge for getting things, brand new replacements for things. You have to expect to have to invest in the redecoration of your property on a relatively regular basis. And you can't make the buck stop with the final tenant, who has been very happy to occupy the property and pay the rent, despite the fact that the decor is 10 years old. They don't have a problem with it, but it doesn't mean that it is reasonable for them to be charged to have the property redecorated. So be realistic about things like fair wear and tear. Be realistic about the type of remedy that you're seeking. And I think if things do get to the stage where an adjudicator has to make a decision for you, the other thing I would very much encourage you to do is not just to, want of a better word, dump all the evidence at the adjudicator's door. We're not a court, but we are making a decision that's similar to a court. And you need to explain your case. You need to draw out the parts of your evidence that are important. The adjudicator is not there to construct your claim. They need to understand what it's about. They need to understand the parts of your evidence that you feel really hit home and support your claim. Kristjan's platform does a lot of that. Our own platform, if you're coming direct to us, takes you through a structured series of questions. And these questions are designed to draw out your points of evidence. Please take them seriously. Don't just write, please see attached. Answer the questions, because they're there to help you. They're there to draw your story out, so that the adjudicator can make their way through what is often many hundreds of pages worth of evidence. And you wouldn't put a big pile of papers down in front of a judge and say, just look at it. You would be expected to present a case that said, and on page 45 of the inventory, you will find the description of what that table was like at the start of the tenancy. And on page 26 of the checkout, you will find what it was like at the end.
Brilliant. I've read, we have had an absolute shed load of questions in. So Kristjan, I guess I'd just like to pick up on one part of this with you, if that's okay, which is, it's come through the questions. There are some real challenges where there are a load of different issues that come up through a deposit dispute. how do you view that in terms of ring fencing individual things and possibly being able to chip away at them?
So look, I think one of the things, just sort of coming back to your question before to Alison about what can agents do, putting my agent hat on, I just want to talk about one thing that we have in place and two things that we're putting in place now at base. So one thing we've had at base for nearly a decade now is a service that we call maintenance, which is a property life skills tutorial for our tenants. So all of our tenants, when they're moved into a property, we will do about a 30-minute property life skills tutorial. And what that means is we'll talk them, we'll make sure they know where their meters and stopcock valves are. We'll make sure they know how their heating and hot water controls work. If they've got a gas central heating system, we'll show them how to bleed a radiator, how to top up the pressure on the boiler. We will talk them through appliance maintenance. So, dishwashers, put a cleaning cycle on once in a while, freezers, defrost them once in a while, et cetera, et cetera. We talk them through drain maintenance, good idea, once a quarter, just to chuck some drain cleaner down the drains, keep them flowing. But one of the most important parts of that process is we talk about condensation and mold and how to identify the start of it and how to hopefully identify the cause of it and then act accordingly. And what we find in most cases is that condensation leading to mold is typically caused by tenants, not intentionally. They live in a property where they're doing a lot of laundry, they're doing a lot of cooking, they're having a lot of showers, whatever it is, and they're not suitably ventilating or extracting that moisture out of the air. That is condensing and causing mold, and that then leads to an issue at the end of the tenancy. What we do is we educate the tenants to spot it and to either address it, or if they feel it is a landlord related issue, to immediately bring that to our attention so we can address it. And when we do the life skills tutorial, we not only do that, but at the end of that, we have a certificate that they sign where we state on there every piece of information that we've gone through and everything they've been educated. So mold, a lot of agents watching this will know that is another very common issue in deductions and disputes, is mold, who's liable, etc., etc. So that's one of the things we do to mitigate that. So if we get to that stage, there is no void of ignorance. The tenant can't go, oh, I didn't realize that's what I had to do to prevent that happening. We've educated them at the start. So that's something that we've had in place for nearly a decade now. Two of the things that we're implementing, one of the things Alison actually talked about, some of our agents that we work with at the Depositary already do this, and they go about a month before a tenancy ends with the tenant with at least a tenant in situ to have a look at the property and go, by the way, you need to have a look at this, this, and this before you move out, because in our eyes, that is something that we would be likely to charge a dilapidation for if you don't resolve it. Alison is absolutely spot on. I relayed that to her. We had a conversation about this a week or so ago. And at the time, one of our responses was, I have no idea how people work that in. Off the back of that conversation, we've actually worked out how we're going to work that into our company. So we're going to be implementing that at base. I think we're starting it from next week. And we're actually going to have that happen about 6 weeks before a tenancy ends. And that's primarily for two reasons. A, it's to have that conversation with the tenant, but it is also to start the conversation with the landlord about reasonable maintenance, but before we get to the end of the tenancy, so they're not automatically aligning that to the tenant. So if we go into a flat, and like we talked about, there's a property which hasn't been painted in 8 years and it's looking tired, let's start that conversation at 6 weeks and go, hey, Mr. Landlord, we've been to the property with a view to, making sure that the tenants hand it back right and we're ready for your next tenant. Checking our records, we can see, last time you painted it was 8 years ago. It's really looking tired. Let's have that conversation now. Guess what? You agree that the landlord agrees to repaint it. You get to that checkout where there's 30 scuffs on the wall, not even a conversation, because the landlord's already agreed to pay £1,500 to have the property repainted. So that is irrelevant. So that's something that we're putting in place. And another thing we're putting in place, and this is something that the Depositary has enabled us to do, is by putting our tenancies through the Depositary, we can now easily go through every tenancy we've concluded and we can easily see what those deductions are. We're currently creating an email of our top 10 most popular deductions, most common deductions, I should say. and how tenants can mitigate those. And a lot of those are really obvious, like gardens not suitably maintained, or the tenant does the garden a couple of days before and then leaves 15 sacks of garden waste for someone to dispose of. Personal effects left in a property, that's a really common one for us. Items that tenants just don't want anymore, they leave behind, rubbish, etc. Light bulbs, really, really common. Typically most agents will charge £5 a light bulb, and tenants will usually go, what do you mean 8 light bulbs don't cost 40 quid? You can buy a pack of 8 light bulbs from Asda for £3.50. Yes, but somehow those light bulbs have to magically levitate their way to the property and install themselves. So mold on bathroom and kitchen mastic.
Sorry, Kristjan, I think due to time, we are going to have to run through as many of the questions that have come through. These are all going to be quick fire. So put your hand up or shout your answer. Are you ready? So the first is AST says that tenants can't smoke within the property. They've clearly been smoking. What evidence should be submitted as part of that? Answer?
It's down to the checkout, isn't it? Yeah. To just state in words that the property smells of cigarette smoke. If it's more serious than that, you might be able to take a picture off the wall and show that there's damage to the decor. You might be able to get a cleaning company in to say that they've done all they can, but they haven't been able to eradicate the strong smell of cigarettes.
You might also be able to evidence from interim inspections as well. If you've been in to do periodic inspections and there's been evidence of smoking and you flagged that with the tenants, again, it proves that you've had that conversation and that's been evidenced during the tenancy as well as at the checkout.
Next question came up in a few different guises. To what extent, if any, ought or must the inventory clerk be independent?
Look, I think a lot of larger landlords and letting agents do have an internal service. I don't categorically think. I think if you use an independent one, it removes the assinuation or the ability to accuse a party of being independent. That said, as landlords now have to pay for a check-in and check-out, I don't know. Can you argue, even if it's an independent party, that the single part, one side paying for both ends of that transaction, it could be truly independent? I mean, one of the things I liked pre-tenancy fee ban was landlord paid check-in, tenant paid check-out. We had a party that had been paid by both interested parties, and that, for me, gave a sort of a middle ground independence. But I think as long as it's detailed and you give and it's evidenced, facts beat emotions or accusations every time.
On facts specifically, a question for Alison here is the pack of information that you suggested. So this is how X works, Y works, and anything else. Ought that be submitted to the adjudicators as part of a dispute if it's pertinent to the dispute? To show
you can do. Actually, I would just suggest you list it in the inventory that all these manuals are available. But of course, you can submit them as well.
The next one is not a question, but a plea or a request or a suggestion for the industry, which is, can we please stop talking about an inventory and start talking about an inventory and a schedule of condition so that everybody is a bit clearer about what's within there? Do you have any views on terminology there?
I mean, that is the correct terminology, but it's just quite a mouthful. I mean, that is correct. But I always say, when people start talking about schedules of condition, I always say it needs to be condition and cleanliness, please. People do tend to say things are in good condition and think that means they're clean. I don't agree with that. Okay, something can be clean but really quite old and worn. Equally, something can be in good condition but not clean. So please,
bottom line is, the more detailed,
condition and cleanliness,
the more detailed a record is, and if it's validated by both parties, it's very difficult for either party to then dispute that record at a later date.
And I'm afraid we have run out of time for the rest of the questions, but thank you very much. What we will do is we'll do a write-up of today's webinar, and we will try and incorporate as many of the questions and answers as part of that as possible. If you'd like to keep up to date with any of our webinars and what's going on, please follow us on all good social media channels. And if you have any suggestions on topics or any insights, please email research@fixflo.com. Our next webinar is a quarterly legal and compliance update with David Smith of JMW Solicitors. And with that, I would just like to thank our panelists, Alison and Kristjan, for giving up their time and sharing their insights, and to everyone in the audience for being part of today. Thank you all so much, and I wish you a wonderful, moderately sunny, possibly even the start of summer day. Thank you so much.
Raj, thanks for having us. Get out there, enjoy
Thanks,
the one
Raj.
day of summer, people.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.